So without further ado, we're very honored to have you today, Claudia, and to share your experience. You have a lot of experience in this area, and bring to us sort of the perspective of UNICEF on child marriage, the latest trends, and future prospects. Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. The honor, the privilege, the pleasure is actually all mine. When you invite a nerd like me to present data work on child marriage, it is actually a fun activity for me and really a pleasure to be able to do so with this audience today. So as Andola mentioned, my responsibility within UNICEF is very much in support of countries' ability to collect data on different topics of well-being. And of course, we use the data that has been collected through the National Statistical Office of the countries around the world to be able to put together data analysis to understand the situation of girls and boys around the world, and to use this data for advocacy purposes, but also for orienting policies and programs. And in the presentation I want to share with you today, I want to give you an overview of the way in which we collect and analyze data related to child marriage. And of course, I would like to give you an overview of the current levels of child marriage, the progress to date, and the projection to 2030. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see the screen, so therefore I may see myself unable to see whether you have the presentation in front of you. So I would be grateful for a confirmation that it's actually indeed you're able to see the slide. Yes, now I can see that. Before I go into the outline, I just wanted to mention that, of course, my presentation today will focus on child marriage among girls. But child marriage exists also among boys, and it's a violation of children's rights, regardless of sex. So my presentation today will have a specific focus on child marriage among girls, with the recognition that the problem exists also among boys, and over 115 million men and boys around the world were married during their childhood. So in today's presentation, and if we can go to the next slide, I will show very briefly what I'm going to be talking about. First of all, I will indulge for a couple of minutes on discussions related to definitions, data sources, and indicators, because this will be important to set the stage for the actual data that we'll present later on. Then I will give you an overview of the global situation when it comes to the total number of girls and women who were married in their childhood, but also the regional distribution and the characteristics of the girls who are most at risk of becoming child brides. I will then use the second part of my presentation to look at the trends over time. So going back 25 years ago and comparing with the situation we have today. And by today, I mean essentially 2020, so the period before the pandemic. And then in the last part of my presentation, I will talk about what the future might look like. And of course, we are going to be using projection, pre-COVID and post-COVID, to consider what is the future going to look like, what is the projected number of child brides that might occur over the next 10 years. So let me start by talking a little bit about definitions, and what do we mean by child marriage. Of course, as somebody working in the data field, I look at this from the point of view of operational definitions. I'm looking at this from the point of view of defining a set of questions that will allow us to gather information from women about the point in time or the age at which they were first married. So the term child marriage is used to refer here to both formal marriages and informal unions, in which a girl or a boy, in this case, of course, I will be focusing on girls, as mentioned earlier, lives with a partner as if married before the actual age of 18. And we are covering both formal marriages, in which there is a ceremony. Some of these marriages might even be recorded, not many, but some of them are actually be officially registered. But we're also capturing informal unions, which are defined as a situation where a couple live together and has a lasting relationship. Now, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, we are also including in this definition of child marriages also visiting unions, which are, of course, different and have specific characteristics. But if I want to oversimplify a bit what the reality of visiting unions are, they refer to prolonged relationship. In this case, cohabitation is not necessarily an element, but of course, there is a situation where a man and a woman have this relationship over time. And we long debated on whether or not this concept of visiting unit should be included in our statistics because it does have an impact on the overall prevalence. And in order for us to be able to decide, we look at the characteristics of these girls and whether or not they share similar vulnerabilities with girls who are in informal union or formal marriages. And indeed, it looks like there are certain common vulnerabilities, and therefore we adopted this larger definition of child marriage. Now, in the presentation that I will display in a second, we are going to be using some specific data sources. And this is what I wanted to talk about in my next slide. It's really to give a sense of what type of data I'm using to be able to report on child marriage. So first of all, we are using household survey data. So data that are gathered in the context of a household survey, surveys that are based on large nationally representative samples of women. And we are doing so because the point of my presentation will be revolved very much around prevalence of child marriage and characteristics of these girls. So it's a presentation that focuses on statistical evidence, and it's built on UNICEF global databases that we update at regular intervals in consultation with the National Statistical Office of countries across the world. And these databases include data for over 150 countries across the world. Of course, in some cases, most of the data are from low and middle income countries, because this is where most of the problem of child marriage in terms of size of the problem applies. Most of the analysis that I'm going to present are based on data from 2012 to 2020. And I mention this because we shouldn't be concerned about having child marriage data from 2012 or 2015 as being not that recent. And the reason why we shouldn't be concerned is because, as many other demographic variables, marriages is not something that would radically change very quickly from one year to the other. It's not like an indicator such as, for instance, immunization rate or birth registration coverage, where you can possibly in some contexts expect fluctuation. In the case of child marriage, and you will see this through the data, levels tend to be pretty stable from one year to the next, and of course change over a longer time period. So the global estimate that I'm going to present will focus on, will be representative of at least 60% of the world population of women. So we have enough data to make generalized statement with, of course, adequate weighting. And the regional estimates reflect at least 50%, if not more, of the regional population. Now, going into the indicators, and again, I apologize for setting the stage on something that might sound a little bit nerdy, but I think it's fundamental to talk about measures as a way of facilitating the interpretation of the findings. Because when we talk about child marriage, we can use very different measures to report on the size of the problem. Certain indicators are stronger than others from the point of view of providing a complete prevalence estimate. And these are the indicators that have been selected for the Sustainable Development Goal target 5.3, which include a specific mention to the need for countries to work towards the elimination of harmful practices, including child marriage and female genital mutilation. And the reason why I'm saying this type of indicator are stronger is because, of course, we want to be able to report on a complete prevalence of the problem. And this is only possible when we investigate and we present the level of child marriage among a population of women who are no longer children. Because this means that these young women, those who have passed the age of 18, have completed their exposure period, and therefore they're no longer at risk of becoming child brides because they age out of childhood. So in my presentation, I will use a mix of indicators because depending on what I'm trying to say, I need to rely on overall measure, on different measures. But my point is here to say the most used indicator is the one that really focus on young adults, young women, and report back retrospectively to the level of child marriage among them. Now let's go into the meat of the presentation, and let's start with current levels. So worldwide, 650 million girls and women were married in childhood. These burden numbers comprise girls who are currently girls. They are still below the age of 18 and they're already married, but also include women who are now older who were married in their childhood. And this gives really the significance of child marriage. And the reason why we are including in this overall number also women who are now, for instance, 45 years old, is because when you are a child bride, the consequences of being child bride are felt throughout your lifetime. So we felt it was really necessary, and this is a UNICEF estimate, to account for those who are already, like girls who are already married, as well as women who were married as children. And as you can see here, the distribution of this overall number is not obviously equally distributed, because most of these women are actually located in South Asia. And this because, of course, South Asia is a region where the prevalence of child marriage remain high, but also is a region where there is a significant population of girls and women. And if we want to zoom even further on the countries that contribute the most to this impressive number of 650 million, are actually 5 countries: Bangladesh, India, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Brazil account for slightly over 50% of the 650 million girls and women who were married in childhood. And again, this is the result of a high prevalence of child marriage, but also of the significance of the female population in these countries. Now, in the next slide, we are actually shifting a little bit the focus. And now we are looking at risk of child marriage as indicated by the prevalence, so the percentage of girls and women. And again, I'm using here the official SDG indicator, so young women age 20-24 who were first married or in union before age 18 and before age 15. And you can see the yellow is those who were married before the age of 18, and a subset of these women were actually married before they even reached the age of 15, and which is displayed now in a brown color. And you can clearly see that overall worldwide, we currently stand at a prevalence of child marriage of around 20%. So 1 in 5 young women were married in their childhood, and the levels are particularly high in West and Central Africa and in Eastern and Southern Africa. Now, going to the next slide, one important point, consideration to make when, in terms of the years, this is the most recently available data for each one of the countries comprise the global estimate, which, as I mentioned earlier, is based on over 100 countries with available data. So we use the prevalence as the most recent that it is in this year period of 2012 to 2020. Yes, indeed. And please feel free to interrupt at any point for questions. I can see the questions popping up. Now, of course, it's very important to talk about global prevalence. It's very important to talk about regional distributions of the 650 million. It's important to talk about regional prevalence, but it's also very important to look at disaggregation, further disaggregation, because the prevalence of child marriage varies significantly across countries. And even if we look at the countries, the region with the highest prevalence, which is West and Central Africa, you can see that there are significant variation within this region, across country, but also within countries. And this map focuses on presenting disaggregated data at the subnational level for the Sahel region. As you know, cuts across a number of countries, going from east to west in Africa, and you can clearly see that there are certain areas of concentration even in Western Central Africa, with level of child marriage that goes above 80% in certain sub-regions of sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus on Western Central Africa. So disaggregation of the values of the prevalence is very important because it allows us to understand who are the girls who are actually most at risk and what are also the characteristics of these girls. And I want to dwell a little bit further on this element of disaggregation with the next example that I wanted to display in the next slide. And this is a level of disaggregation that take into consideration ethnicity as being another variable for disaggregation. This graph shows the prevalence of child marriage using survey data coming from a subset of countries in in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where there is a significant portion of the Roma population living in those countries. These are Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. And you can see displayed in this slide the level of child marriage between the Roma population and the national population excluding the Roma. And as you can see, the differences are enormous. In the case of Montenegro, the prevalence of child marriage among the Roma women is 63% for marriages before the age of 18, compared to only 4% if we were to look at the national prevalence excluding the Roma population. So again, this points to the importance of really using disaggregated data, which are available and possible when large samples, of course, are captured in the survey, to understand the characteristics of girls who are most at risk of child marriage. Of course, I can have a similar presentation looking at level of education, looking at place of residence, whether it's urban and rural, etc. So, and there are plenty of such analysis in the publication that I'll talk about in a second. So let me pause here to see if you have any burning question on the current levels of child marriage, because what follows will be centered around the progress to date. So I just wanted to check whether you have any specific questions about the current level of the practice. So I see that there was a question about the pros and cons of measuring current marriage among 15 to 17 versus age at first marriage among the 20 to 24 years old. Thank you so much, Esther, for this question. There are pros and cons, and of course, using both measures. Let me talk a little bit about the 15 to 17 indicator. This is an indicator of the current prevalence of child marriage among adolescent girls. So it's very useful when we want to have a pulse of the most recent events. These are girls, they're still adolescent. Some of them are already married, others are not married yet. So when it comes to measuring trends, it's a much more sensitive measure to change that might occur between 2 points in time, because it's a current level, right? At the same time, it's a measure that is affected by the risk of censoring, because some of these girls are not married, not because they will not be married in childhood, simply because they have not yet reached the age of marriage. So in this sense, it's a prevalence that is not complete. And therefore, it doesn't give you a full appraisal and assessment of the entire risk of being married in childhood. On the other hand, when you look at retrospective measures, like the one that focus on girls who are 20-24 married by 18 or 18-24 married by 18, the prevalence is complete. Because by the time you become an adult, you are no longer at risk of being married as a child. So the prevalence is higher, the risk is more precise. At the same time, there is a retrospective element that makes this measure less sensitive to change when you're trying to compare indicators. Because if you take an 18 years old, of course, she might have been married a year ago, 2 years ago, right? So it's still recent. But when you look at a woman who is now 23, 24, she was married at least 6 years prior to this moment of the survey. So it's not as sensitive to capturing changes as well as the 15 to 17 current level of child marriage. I hope this gives a sufficient explanation in terms of difference between the two indicators. So if there are no other burning questions, let me go to the progress to date section. So what has happened over the last 25 to 30 years? Has the progress of child marriage decreased? Well, yes, there has been progress in reducing the prevalence of child marriage. And this progress, as you can see, it occurs worldwide and also across regions. So let's start by the global progress. As you can see, this is displayed with these tiny dots. The world values are to the right-hand side. And you can see that comparing 25 years ago to 10 years ago and to today, and today means, again, the most recently available data for each one of the countries that are then summarized in a global value, you can see that the progress are actually being more significant in the last decade. So there was already a little decline, let's say, but most of the changes have occurred uh, in the last 10 years. Now, the progress, however, has not been even, and you can clearly see that the progress has mostly been driven by the decline in South Asia. South Asia had a level of child marriage of approximately 60% about 25 years ago, and now the level stands at around 30%. So almost a cut by half within 25 years, with most of the progress again occurring in the last 10 years. I also want to highlight regions where this progress has not been occurring at all. And for us, it was striking to see how Latin America has stagnated over the same time frame. So the level of child marriage are practically remain unchanged at around, let's say, 25% in Latin America over the last 25 years. Now, with this spirit of trying to understand exactly what's driving these global and regional patterns, I have chosen to show the decline that has occurred in the level of child marriage in India. And this is what is displayed in the next slide, where you will see that we have used data coming from different household surveys that have taken place in India over a long period of time. And using these retrospective indicators, we have been able to reconstruct, going backwards, the prevalence of child marriage over time. It's something that requires adjustment and modeling, so we cannot just use straight household survey data. But the overall point that I wanted to display is the dramatic decline that has occurred in India since the 70s, when the level of child marriage was around 74%, and it now stands at 27%. So dramatic decline. And because, of course, we are talking about India, that has a significant population, of course, of girls and women, you can see how this change has trickled down and had impact on the overall prevalence of child marriage. So what is the consequence of these lines going down, let's say globally, driven by India? It's essentially what is displayed in the next slide, where we can clearly see that the observed number of child brides between 2010, let's say in 2020, stood at 110 million, which is of course a significant number. But there have been 25 million child marriages that have been averted thanks to that progress, that line going down that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago. So a significant portion of the population that was married indeed in the last 10 years, but also 25 million child marriages that have been averted thanks to this progress that has occurred, particularly driven by the case of India. Now, I wanted to underscore again the importance of disaggregation, also to understand where this progress has occurred, not just geographically, and we saw that this was mainly occurring in South Asia, but also what type of women, girls, to be precise, actually, were able to benefit from this progress. And this is what is displayed in the next slide. The rate of progress has been uneven also across population group. And this is a very dense slide, and definitely a slide that requires improvement in terms of visualization. But this slide look at the trends across the region and globally, looking at the poorest quintile of women, so the women in the poorest quintile of the wealth distribution, and women in the richest. The richest are obviously at the bottom because they have a lower level of child marriage. The poorest are at the top. And as you can see, the improvements that have occurred have actually benefited mostly women who were already at an advantage from the point of view of the wealth distribution. So the progress has been fastest among the richest women, while among the poorest one has actually stagnated. You see that in the case of the world, the level of child marriage, comparing the prevalence among the youngest cohort of women and the oldest cohort of women, the line is flat. So there has been no change for the poorest women. And in some region, and I want to particularly point at the case of Western Central Africa and Eastern and Southern Africa, there has actually been an increase in the prevalence of child marriage among the poorest segment of the population over the last 25 years, more or less, while the richest have indeed been able to see the level of child marriage reduce significantly. So a lot of thinking, of course, in terms of the impact of the various policies and interventions, because clearly there has been inequity in the way in which this progress has trickled down. Now, what might the future hold? So what are we saying in terms of what can we expect? Well, before I go into the actual presentation of what the future might hold on the basis of the projection, we have to, of course, differentiate the pre-COVID projection and the COVID affected projection. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to take a moment to explain a little bit further what I mean by pre-COVID and post-COVID. The way we normally elaborate projection is by looking at what had happened over the last 25 years, the last 10 years, and trying to project this progress going forward, considering the adjusted risk, because as we said, we have seen progress. So we project a continued decline, for instance, or an accelerated decline. But then we also take into consideration population dynamics, because as the risk might decrease, in certain parts of the world, the population of women is increasing, and therefore a risk has to decline faster than the increase in the population if we want to change the prevalence, but also change the overall number of girls who are married in childhood. Now, the first part of my presentation is going to focus on the pre-COVID projection, and then I will also share with you the results of a COVID-specific analysis we released actually yesterday that look at what the impact of COVID-19 on child marriage are going to look like. So let's start with the next slide, which covers the pre-COVID projection. So we talk about progress, and we do need to celebrate the progress that has been accomplished. At the same time, the progress is not sufficient to achieve elimination of the practice by 2030, which is the target of the Sustainable Development Goal. And this graph summarizes the trends that I mentioned earlier. So the prevalence of child marriage 25 years ago, the prevalence of child marriage 10 years ago, today, but also the projected value by 2030, considering a continuation of the progress or the stagnation that we saw in the past. This is what the future might look like or could have looked like before COVID. You remember South Asia? It used to be 60% prevalence, then dropped to 30%. Well, despite of this incredible progress and applying this progress over the next 10 years, you will see that the region will not be on track to eliminate the risk of child marriage, by 2030. And other regions, of course, have made even less progress, and therefore they are even less likely to achieve elimination by 2030. So not a single region is actually on track to eliminate the practice by 2030, even if we don't consider the detrimental impact of COVID-19. And in the next slide, we have done this type of analysis, but at the country level. Again, another complex graph, but this graph showed that the countries that are on track to eliminate child marriage by 2030, and these are in the blue segment of the graph. And then you have the countries that are not on track because they have made progress, but the progress is too slow. And then you also have at the bottom, in the dark brown, the countries where child marriage has stagnated completely or has actually increased, and therefore they are not on track, because being on track means that you're going down, which is not the case. And you can clearly see from this display that there are only 3 countries in the world that are actually on track towards eliminating the practice of child marriage by 2030. Now, if we consider this projection, where will the world be by 2030? And this is what is displayed in the next slide. Because of the different pace of decline, actually, if the trends that we saw continue, Latin America and the Caribbean will become the second region in the world for the prevalence of child marriage by 2030, followed by only Sub-Saharan Africa. So Western Central Africa, Eastern and Southern Africa will continue to be the top 2 subregions for prevalence of child marriage, but you can see Latin America will stay there at 25%. So the geography of the risk will change significantly because of the fast progress in South Asia and because of the stagnation in Latin America and the Caribbean. But how fast will the progress need to be for the world to be able to eliminate the practice of child marriage by 2030? And this is what is shown in the next graph. So what has been observed in the past 25 years is an average rate of decline of 0.7 on an annual basis. In the last 10 years, there has been an acceleration of this progress. So the progress has been on average, again, on an annual basis of around a little bit shy of 2%. But 23% will be the required annual rate of reduction in the prevalence of child marriage if we were to be on track towards eliminating the practice by 2030. So the progress has to be more than 11 times faster than what has been the case. Now let's look at now the COVID situation for a second. So in the next slide, please. Even this in the COVID scenario, we were expecting, because the progress has not been as fast and because of population dynamic, the projected number of child brides between now and 2030 was estimated to be 100 million, even with a continuation of the progress that we saw. But COVID has, of course, made this target of elimination even more ambitious to reach. Why? Because we know that child marriage is triggered by economic crisis, because we know that child marriage is more common among the poorest. Child marriage is often seen as a coping mechanism, but also because child marriage is triggered by teenage pregnancy. And with the disruption in reproductive and health services, for instance, girls are more likely to end up with a pregnancy, and therefore more likely to be buried as a consequence of this pregnancy. We also know that education has been disrupted, and education is a protective factor for child marriage. So with school disruption, some girls might not be able to go back to school at any point, not even when the schools are able to safely reopen. So because of that, we know that COVID-19 brings an added risk to the prevalence of child marriage. And this is what we try to estimate with the publication that was released yesterday. And if we go to the next slide, you will see that, sorry, let's skip this one, we go to the next one. If we can now see to the projected 100 million child brides who, even prior to COVID, were expected to get married in the next 10 years, because of COVID, we expect an additional 10 million more child brides to be coming 10 million girls becoming child brides, specifically because of what COVID has triggered in terms of impact, socioeconomic impact. So, of course, in our recommendation in the publication that was presented yesterday, we talk about what governments can do to put in place measure to address this additional risk, but also to make sure that as we reduce the risk of getting married for these 10 million girls, we don't forget the 100 million that were already projected and at risk of becoming child brides prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this completes my presentation. Apologies for taking longer than originally allocated, and I will be happy, of course, to answer any question you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. This is really amazing work that you're doing. I do have, in the interest of time, I'm going to read two questions that came. One from Hamed and talking about the Middle East region and asking is there any chance for improvement in the current decade for the Middle East region. And the second question is from Erin, and she's asking for you to comment a little bit on Latin America and the Caribbean. Why is the progress so stagnant from the point of view of UNICEF?
In full disclosure, I have an easy job, or at least easier than my colleagues working at the level of programs. Because as a statistician, my first responsibility is to make sure that the data that are collected are accurate and reliable and robust, and we analyze them and present them. Of course, I am not in charge of policy and programs, and therefore it's a little bit adventurous of me to jump into conclusions of why certain things have happened in a certain way and what can be done. But let me give a general sense on the basis of what I learned myself by interacting with those working at the level of policies and programs. The stagnation that we saw in Latin America can be, of course, as any stagnation in the prevalence of child marriage, the result of a combination of multiple factors. Because as I mentioned earlier, those who have not benefited from the progress in child marriage are those who are actually the most vulnerable girls. And the progress that has been seen in many other regions are actually benefited girls who were the richest, the most advantaged. So this is what has not happened in Latin America. So there is the core vulnerable group of girls, and their vulnerability has not been addressed over the last 20, 25 years. So of course, it's a region where the progress has not been seen because, of course, the levels was lower to begin with, but also because these great pockets of deep vulnerability that has to do with poverty, that has to do belonging to certain ethnic groups, etc., have not been addressed. Now, the case of the Middle East and Middle East and North Africa, we can clearly see that there has been a significant progress between 25 years and 10 years ago. And then there has been a slowdown. This progress has become slower. And this again is something that can be expected because it goes back to these pockets, those hard to reach populations. And in the case of the Middle East, there is clearly a component related to fragility, conflict, that is a very important element to take into consideration. So as we strive to eliminate the practice, those pockets of vulnerability remain, and it becomes almost more difficult to address child marriage among those. because of course there are certain fundamental issues that need to be addressed that are not easy to tackle.
Thank you. Any other questions? Or Erin, do you wanna comment?
I was just saying thank you to Claudia in the chat. I think it really does show that for those of us who are interested in also thinking through interventions to address child marriage, which is where some of our research has been focused in trying to think about what are effective ways in which we can create interventions. What's really tricky is just to see that it's the multi-layered nature of this issue, right? That it's not just access to schooling, but it's this vulnerability and marginalization, and that will require multi-sectoral strategies. So, but I hope there's more funding for this issue in Latin America because I think it's a world region that's been very ignored, and a lot of donors have moved out. And so it's good, I think, that this issue is highlighting how the issue persists there. So, and thank you so much for your presentation. It's, I know there's also a New York Times article today about child marriage, so it's very timely, and we celebrated International Women's Day earlier this week. So just thank you so much for taking the time to come and present with us, Claudia.
Yeah, I think Alicia has a question. Alicia?
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, this has been very good, very interesting talk. And I see that the Maradi region of Niger is the region in the Sahel with the highest rate. So it must be, in fact, I know it is the region in the world with the highest rates of child marriage. From some work that I've been involved in, and it's started as a project of the Bixby Center. We've seen that safe spaces for adolescent girls in northern Nigeria, just over the border from Maradi, has resulted in an increase in the age of marriage among participating girls by 2.5 years. And I know that UNICEF and UNFPA are promoting and helping to bring funding for this kind of safe spaces program. But I'm wondering if there's an effort to try to put controls in place so that more of the budgets, because we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, for example, with UNFPA in West Africa through the Sahel Women's Empowerment and Demographic Dividend. What kinds, do you know anything about what efforts are being made to make sure that a greater part of the funding to prevent adolescent marriage is actually going to direct programming for girls as opposed to other things like community sensitization and so forth?
Thank you for this question. I'm unable to provide an answer. This is certainly not my area of work. There is this global program, and Nankali Maksud is the global program coordinator. She's better placed than I am in responding to all questions related to the interventions of UNICEF on the ground to the global program. Our responsibility in UNICEF is split. And I wanted to underscore this because the work that we do in terms of reporting on current levels and trends and projection comes from the data and analytics section. And we are separate from those working at the level of programs and policy and advocacy, because of course we want to make sure that our contribution is perceived as independent from what UNICEF or other partner agencies do. And it's very much reporting on the situation of girls and children more broadly, or families around the world. So for everything that pertains to what UNICEF does or what UNICEF and partners do, there is a different section in charge, and there is a different person in charge, and we try to retain this distinction very clearly in our work.
So I wanted to ask you something. I didn't see another hand up or question, but I wanted to ask you, Claudia, in the presentation or in the sort of a dissemination of the current estimates, where basically the face of where gold brides will be coming from changes. What is your sense of how are the sort of your colleagues at UNICEF or reacting to it, and And what, is there any expectations that more funding will be available for more data collection or things like that?
Let me first comment on this changing phase of child rights, because that's something that it's an awareness that, thanks to this type of data and analysis, can be brought to the attention of practitioners and stakeholders, including donors. And for us, sometimes we start this analysis because we find something interesting in the data and we want to display it. And this is how the analysis of Latin America came about. And at first, everybody was kind of shocked to say, Latin America really becoming the second region with the highest prevalence of child marriage in the world by 2030? That's what the data is saying. So the face of child marriages is indeed changing, and the data is bringing awareness to this change. Now, of course, whether this awareness is matched with different approaches and intervention and prioritization, that's, again, for my programmatic colleagues to take forward. And I do hope that there's going to be a more focused approach to an evidence-driven decision making when it comes to prioritizing, when it comes to allocating resources, including when it comes to evaluating the where to invest. And on the issue about investing in data and evidence, I think there is a lot to be said about that too, because investing in strengthening data quality, it's not the most appealing of the topics, honestly, among donors, because of course the emphasis needs to be placed on actually programmatic intervention that can have a direct impact on the lives of girls. But at the same time, without this type of analysis and data, we are not able to point the finger at, the places where in population where changes are now occurring. And this type of data collection is extremely expensive.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you, and that's why I wanted you to elaborate a little bit, because even to me, it was important to see that disaggregation that you showed in terms of progress by socioeconomic status, to see, for example, the millions of billions of dollars over the last 10 years or something, the investments that they were made to decrease child marriage, and where did those investments had the biggest impact? I mean, I don't want to say they were given to the rich, because that would be a reaching, right? But the reality is, like, without this type of data and investments of data, and to some of our students here in this presentation, without going further in the indicators to disaggregate data, to look at potential inequities, because if you don't think about it, we'll never find it. Then we wouldn't be able to see that even though huge progress in Southeast Asia, but biggest even among the rich, and the gap between the rich and the poor, it's still tremendous. So well, thank you for yourself and your colleagues at UNICEF, sort of a unit that monitor this and give us the good perspectives on what else we need to do moving forward, and how much we need to pay attention to those inequities, even when we think that we are only reaching the poor, or that this is a problem over the poor. We still make investments that are different, or at least yield different results between poor and the rich.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to point at a resource where you can find all the graphs and the material I presented. They're actually published material. So on our website, we have a dedicated data website, which is data.unicef.org. And then you will find a page dedicated to child marriage, where you will see all the publications that were used. All the graphs will be included in this publication, including the publication that was released yesterday on the International Women's Day, that talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the prevalence and risk of child marriage. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's really amazing.